The book of Ruth, one of the neat things, I was just saying to somebody earlier today, one of the neat things about the book of Ruth is when you actually remember the placement of the book of Ruth, the placement of it in the scriptures, but the placement of it in time. Because remember that these people, Ruth, Boaz, Naomi, Orpah, and the rest, they lived during this time period that we call the time period of the Judges. And we just completed reading through the book of Judges and looking at all of the self-inflicted gunshot wounds of the people during that time period from roughly 350 BC up until, or this time period here, up until around 1100 or so BC. And so to look at the book of Ruth, it's such a refreshment because you remember, there were godly people during this time, and there's always godly people. So just because we have a dark culture around us is no excuse to not be honoring God and pleasing God. And this book is such a great example of that right in the midst of this decrepit society, yet here we have this amazing story of these people that sought God and they found Him. And so, man, I love just that whole background image that these people that we're reading about in this book of Ruth were surrounded by a culture that were not serving God. And I don't even mean the pagan nations. I mean Israel. Even Israel, God's people, the majority of them were not serving God. So this book shows us that not only can you serve God when your culture is not serving God, you can serve God regardless of who you are. I mean, Ruth is a Gentile woman. You remember that from our first half of the book of Ruth? And even the Gentiles can find grace. And I think every one of us in this room are Gentiles. We're not Jewish. And we found grace and forgiveness in the Jewish God, who is the one true God. And so as we look through the first half of the book of Ruth, and then even tonight as we finish up the second half, remember that we're looking at it from two angles, because we're looking at it from the face value of, you have this gal Ruth, and she meets Boaz, and you have Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, from her first marriage with her husband now being passed on. And we're looking at the face value of these people, but we would do it wrong if we didn't look at the spiritual application of the book that's meant to be there, which is Ruth is there to represent the Gentiles coming towards Christ. And we look at Boaz as the Redeemer, representing none other than Jesus Christ himself. And just remember, in pictures, it's never a perfect picture. I mean, you can only take pictures so far, and then it starts to become a little short-handed, especially when somebody or something is representing Jesus Christ. You only take the imagery so far, and then you realize, okay, they're just human examples trying to represent the spiritual, right? Like when Jesus tries to represent resurrection in the Old Testament, he doesn't resurrect people. He does things like they take one bird and they kill it, right? And then they take the dead bird and they dip it in this other bird that's alive, and then they set that bird free to represent resurrection. So there's only so far that the spiritual pictures of the Old Testament can go in representing the spiritual realm. But they're there on purpose. It's not some super spiritual thing that only pastors make up. No, it's intended. We went over that last week about how even Jesus himself said to the two men on the road to Emmaus, have you not read all of the Old Testament stories that are about me? He says. They're there on purpose. And this story of Boaz and Ruth is very clear to understand. Ruth the Gentile, Naomi, her mother-in-law, representing the Jews, and Boaz, the Redeemer, representing Jesus Christ himself. So to get us caught up to where we are now, starting chapter 3, we saw in chapter 1 and 2 the first two factors in approaching the Lord for redemption. In chapter 1, it showed us Ruth, representing the Gentiles, choosing to leave comfort and go and seek God, go towards God. And Ruth chose to do that. With the little knowledge that Ruth had of the one true God, she got to know this Jewish family that she married into in a foreign land for 10 years or more. And she got to become familiar with what they were teaching her about God. And she chose now as Naomi, her mother-in-law, the Jew, was going back home to Israel, she chose to follow after what she knew of God. And she knew she wanted it, and she knew she needed it. And then in chapter 2 of the book of Ruth, we looked at how God's grace will then bring us nearer. And certainly Ruth was a hard-working gal in chapter 2, working out in the fields to earn food for her and her mother-in-law. But the chapter is all about Boaz showing grace. Boaz the Redeemer, blessing her beyond what she deserved. And so as she was coming towards God, God met her in that place. And so that's where chapter 3 now, for the second half of the book, will pick up. Is that we'll get the final two factors in approaching God here in chapter 3 and in chapter 4. And we pick up in chapter 3 where Naomi has just found out that Ruth was gleaning in the house of Boaz. And Naomi says, oh my goodness, that's a near kinsman to us. He's a relative of us. And Naomi, it just clicked, and she's going to turn matchmaker. And she's going to turn into one that wants to set up Ruth for marriage to Boaz. So that's where we pick up now in chapter 3 to get the final half of the story. So chapter 3, I want to set it up this way. This is the third factor now in approaching God for redemption. And we're going to see Ruth's humility and her attitude of service. This is her posture now in chapter 3. Now that she's caught the eye of the kinsman redeemer Boaz, now you see in this chapter the way she now approaches Boaz. Now that they have a relationship, now what is her part of the relationship now? And that's what we're going to see in chapter 3. Now that she knows this Boaz, how does she now approach him, relate to him? Chapter 3, verse 1. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said unto her, my daughter, shall I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? And if you remember, even back in chapter 1, when Naomi was trying to send her two daughter-in-laws and tell them, just stay here in Moab. I'm going back to Israel. You two just stay here. Ruth, and then Orpah was the other one, right? And one of the things she said to them is, I cannot provide you rest anymore. And the indication in the language is, I can't provide you another husband for you to have rest. As if all single ladies were seeking marriage and children. Now my life is fulfilled. And so that's what Naomi's indication is here, is she's saying, I want to find you a husband and the way to settle down. Stephen, is this little speaker on right? Just double check it. So that's the indication here in chapter 3, verse 1, is that Naomi is wanting Ruth to get settled down, okay? Chapter 3, verse 2. And now, and Naomi is still talking, and now is not Boaz of our kindred, with whose maidens you were with? Behold, he is winnowing barley tonight in the threshing floor. Wash yourself, therefore. This is Naomi giving Ruth advice. Wash yourself, therefore, and anoint thee, and put thy clothes upon thee, and get thee down to the floor. But don't make yourself known unto the man, Boaz, until he has been done eating and drinking. And in verse 4, it shall be that when he lies down, that you shall mark the place where he lies down, and then thou shalt go in and uncover his feet and lay thee down, and he will tell you what you should do. So that's all you need to do, and then Naomi's expecting Boaz to kick in at that point. And in verse 5, and she said to her, all that you say to me, I will do. So as if Ruth, representing the Gentiles, hears from Naomi, representing Israel, and says, oh, okay, is that the way we're to do this? Okay, I will do it. And so know that the situation is that there was a common threshing floor typically in each town. And so all of the people would bring their harvest to the threshing floor, and they'd have to, rent out time, basically to when their time was to thresh out the wheat. So, Naomi, she's scheming, right? And she goes online and she Googles and finds out exactly when it's Boaz's time to be using the floor. And she's like, okay, he's scheduled to be there tonight. So you're going down there tonight. And Naomi's got this all set up. She's planning this out, and she knows exactly when to send Ruth down there. And so once they're done at this common threshing floor, they have to wait with it until they can get it all bagged up and bring it all back home. And so that's why the people that were threshing out the wheat would be there overnight until they can get it all gathered up and take it home. They're protecting it. And so now, notice how Ruth approaches here. Notice Naomi's advice to her for how to approach. She tells her, now remember, Ruth now has the right to go to Boaz and present herself and say, listen, I am the widow of someone in your family. You're expected by Jewish law to marry me. She has every right to go to him, play the victim, and ask him to marry her. You expect it. You need to marry me. I'm the victim here, and it's your job to do something. I demand my rights. She could do that. That is the right, proper thing to do. And notice how people could approach this in different ways. She could come up to the side, demand my rights, do this, and she could have a chip on her shoulder, be a real jerk about it. Or she could simply come up humbly and say, you have to do this. But she doesn't do any of that. She approaches him humbly and just presents herself to him. Instead, she's being told by Naomi here to take the position of a servant. Go and lie at his feet. Show him that you're as one of his handmaidens. Show him that you're just there to serve. Don't go lie at his side. Don't go lay at his head. Lay at his feet. Present yourself as one that's willing to work and serve and just be with him. She has the right to be his wife. And the advice is, go just present yourself as a servant. And again, still in the spiritual world, that's the right way for us to approach God. God has allowed us to come into the family and be sons and daughters. But yet the right approach by us is still to come to God and say, God, I just want to be your servant. I just want to be a servant in the house of God is better than to be on the outside. And when we have that approach, then God says, come here. You're not a servant. Servants don't know my business. I call you friends. I call you sons. I call you daughters. Come in. And so she's presenting with this humility and with this attitude of service. That's the way Naomi advises her to go do this. And now let's see how this happens, starting in verse 6. So she went down to the threshing floor, and she did according to all that her mother-in-law asked her to do. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of corn, and she came softly and uncovered his feet and lied down. There's no reason to read that in any way other than literally what it means, that she literally lay at his feet. Now, some have tried to interpret the language to mean other things, that there was other intimate contact. It doesn't need to be there in the scriptures, and it doesn't flow with the whole rest of the model, with how she's acting, with how he's acting, in integrity. So there's no reason to read beyond. She literally lay at his feet. She presented herself as a servant at his feet. And in verse 8, it came to pass at midnight that the man was afraid, and he turned. It's dark, right? It's midnight. And all of a sudden, what's going on down there? Is that a snake? You know what? And in verse 8, it came to pass at midnight that the man was afraid and turned himself. And behold, a woman lay at his feet. This would only been men servants out there working, right? And in verse 9, he said, who art thou? And she said, I am Ruth, thy future wife. I demand that you marry me. No, I am Ruth, thy handmaiden. Spread therefore thy skirt over thy handmaiden, for you are a near kinsman. Spread thy skirt is literally an ask for marriage. She's saying, I am your servant, and I humbly ask that you marry me. She proposes. So this is a humble ask for marriage. She's presenting herself as this hardworking servant. She's not being presumptuous. She didn't come to him in the middle of the day demanding her rights. I'm here in front of all the townspeople, and I ask you to marry me, and if you don't, look at all these people that are going to be that you're going to embarrass. No, she comes at night, humbly at night, as if to say, look, if this goes sideways, nobody's going to be embarrassed here. I'm not going to embarrass him for refusing. I'm doing this humbly. Everything about this is a humble approach. Now look, it's bold, but it's not inappropriate. It's bold for her to come to him at night, but there's nothing in the language here that would say that there was anything done that was inappropriate. Is it inappropriate for her to propose? No. Is it inappropriate for her to literally uncover his feet and lay at his feet? No. It's bold, but it's not inappropriate. She's presenting herself as a servant, as a handmaiden, and she knows that he holds the answer to all of this. She's just putting the ball in his court. She's presenting herself to him. She's not demanding. She's simply coming into his presence. It's a little bit like Esther. When you think about the story of Queen Esther, right? Now, Queen Esther had to boldly come in before the king, right? At the end of the story, the big punchline. But there wasn't anything inappropriate. There wasn't anything rude or prideful about it. The approach is still humble. It's a bold thing to present yourself in that situation, but there's nothing about the person that says, I demand. Do you see the difference? And it's the same for us as believers. God tells us we can come boldly before the throne of grace and get help for what we need in our times of trouble. We can do that. But even there, in our approach to God, we wouldn't demand, we wouldn't come to God and say, God, because your grace has allowed me to come here, I demand that you now help me. Doesn't that just sound foolish? We're only in the presence of God because of his grace to us. And by that grace, he allows us to come and express our needs and express our heart's desires to him. But to do it in a presumptuous, prideful, I expect you to answer exactly the way I expect it, is wrong. And be careful with that we don't become presumptuous, as if we know the exact right way that things should go. So she clearly is bold, but yet humble. I think this is one of the best examples in the scripture, and a little bit like Esther, of being bold, but yet still having humility. Isn't that interesting? That you can be both bold and showing humility at the same time. And this is a great, great example of that. Verse 10. So he responds in verse 10, and he says, Blessed be thou of the Lord, my daughter, for you have shown more kindness in the latter end than at the beginning, insomuch as you have not followed young men, whether they were poor or rich. Or you have not followed young men, and I'm sorry, I'm going to say it again, because the indication here is two things. You've not followed after young men, and you've also not followed after men, whether they're poor or rich. That's what he's saying to her, is that she's looking for something different than just the earthly, rich, young guy. There's some integrity about what her goals are and what direction, and he can see that. He sees that she's a woman of virtue. He's attracted to her virtue and not her body. There's never been any indication in this story of their physical interest in each other. It's always been about their spiritual character that is what is drawing them to each other. Culture today gives girls the advice that, to go find a man, you need to allure them by taking off your clothes and showing as much as your body as you can. Culture presents that. Even if they don't say those exact words, they're presenting that. This is the way you need to attract a guy. And she was told by Naomi, and then she went and did this. She was told to attract him by the virtue within her of humility and service, hard work. She was given good advice, good godly advice. Attract him with virtue. Some girl, have you ever heard the expression, some girls take off their clothes to reveal their body. Other girls leave their clothes on to reveal their dignity. Because if you want a guy that's interested in you because of your body, that's the way he's going to treat you, as a body. If you want a guy that's attracted to you because of your virtue, your character, your integrity, your spiritual position, that is long lasting. That's going to last. That's going to stay. And that's why they're attracted here. And now in verse 12, now it is true, he says, that I am your near kinsman. However, there is a kinsman that's even nearer than me.
tarry this night, and it shall be in the morning that if he will not perform unto you the part of the kinsman, if he will perform unto you the part of the kinsman, then well, let him do the kinsman's part. But if he will not do the part of the kinsman to you, then will I do the part of the kinsman to you. As the Lord lives, lie down until the morning. So he's not going to send this girl away in the middle of the night through danger. Lie down, and I will do this. But Boaz knows he can't break the law. He's willing to marry her, but he needs to go through the nearer kinsman. That's the law, right? He has to wait. He has to do this the right way. Imagine the situation. Ruth proposes to him, and he's like, oh, whoa, yes, I'm interested in that. However, there's a legal roadblock in our path. There's a person that is an even nearer kinsman, a closer relative to your dead husband than I am. So he has the legal right, not me. So they're in a situation where now they've both found that they're interested in this marriage happening, but they legally cannot do that yet until they find out the intention of the nearer kinsman. And if the nearer kinsman says, yes, I want to marry her, then Boaz is out. He's done. This whole love affair is over. It's over. All of this interest, all of this attractedness to each other's character and spiritual condition will be done if the nearer kinsman is interested in marrying her. Do you ever think of that in the story of Ruth and Boaz? Right? Doesn't it remind you that, so many people, they get interested in a person and they feel like they have to cut corners to make it happen, or they have to cheat, or they have to do something wrong to be able to be with that person. Well, here's Ruth and Boaz faced with a situation where they could run away and elope and be together forever, right? But that wouldn't be right in God's eyes. Look, girls, if it is right for you to be with that guy, you can do it the right way, you could do it the godly way, and God will make it work. And maybe Boaz is saying that to Ruth right now, like, look, Ruth, if this is meant to be for us to be together, then God's going to work this out. Yeah, we have to go through the nearer kinsman first. But if it's right for us to be together, God will work this out. We can do what's right and proper, and God will work it out. We don't have to cheat. We don't have to run away and elope. We could stay in God's will. We could stay in God's path, and God will work it out. And if God doesn't work it out, it wasn't his will, and there's something better. There's something better. And that's the big trust. That's the big ask of faith right here. Will they stay true to their character and their godliness and still follow God, even though now they've got this attractedness to each other? And Boaz says, whoa, lay down. I'm going to talk to the nearer kinsman tomorrow, and we're going to let God's will decide this. Do you see not a dilemma, but do you see the friction there that this causes of trying to remain in God's will? If it's truly God's will, it will work out the right way without us having to force anything to happen. So, now it's interesting here because we've spent a lot of time talking about the spiritual picture here, how Naomi, the mother-in-law, represents Israel, right? Having this knowledge of who God is. Ruth, the Gentile, representing all Gentiles and coming towards God, right? Boaz, the Jewish man of amazingness that he is, being a picture of Jesus Christ himself, the kinsman redeemer. Well, now we're introduced to a new character. We're introduced here to the fact that there is someone nearer in relationship to Ruth than even Boaz. So if Boaz represents Jesus Christ and Ruth is the Gentiles needing redemption, who could this person X, we'll call him, who could he represent? What is the spiritual picture that God's trying to get across here by bringing up the fact that there is yet a nearer relative? Well, we're going to find out. Let's find out through the attributes of this person. So we're going to learn about this person X in chapter 4, And I want you to analyze what we know about him to determine who does he represent in the spiritual realm. Okay? So chapter 3, let's continue here, verse 14. Verse 14. And she lay there at his feet until the morning, and she rose up before one could know another, when it was still dark, right? And he said, let it not be known that a woman came to the floor. I love this, by the way. I'll tell you why in just a second. Verse 15. And he said, bring the veil that you had upon thee and hold it. And when she held it, he measured 6 measures of barley and laid it on her, and she went into the city where her and Naomi were staying. So Ruth sneaks away very early in the morning with all of this food that Boaz lays on her. I love the way when you look at verse 14 and he says, look, okay, get on out of here before anybody knows that you're here. Are they covering up sin? No, they're not. Because there was no sin that happened between them. Nevertheless, he says to her, okay, get out of here before people wake up. Why? To do what Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and 9, to avoid the appearance of evil. See, as moral people don't sin, right? They try not to sin. But Christians, we try to avoid even the appearance of sin. We don't even want to give people the impression that we're in sin. And that's exactly what Boaz is doing. He's like, look, we don't need to stir up any needless controversy as if sin happened last night between us, because it didn't. And so get out of here early so that we don't even want questions being stirred. We don't even want people to think that we were involved in sin. And so they live above reproach. And that's exactly what we should do as Christians. We shouldn't be like pushing the envelope, I always talk about the circle, right, of Christianity with God's heart in the middle. Is your heart always trying to push towards the edge of Christianity to see what you can get away with? Or are you interested in the heart of God? And even here, you see that represented. They're interested in living in such a way that everybody knows they're seeking God. And they're after the heart of God. And so they're avoiding even people thinking they were involved in sin. Now, finish the chapter here, verse 16. And when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, oh, who art thou, daughter? Now remember, it's dark. People are just stirring, getting up in the morning. That's why she doesn't know who's knocking at the door. And in verse 16, and she told her all that the man had done to her. And she said, these 6 measures of barley he gave to me. For he said to me, don't go away empty to your mother-in-law. Then she said, sit still, my daughter, until thou know how the matter will fall. For the man, Boaz, he will not rest until he has finished the thing this day. You have done your part, Ruth. You have stirred up Boaz. He is a man of action, and he is going to do it. They know that the ball is in his court now. Ruth has done her part. Her part is the part of attitude, not action. Her part is the part of deference, not dominion. Her part is the part of piety, not payment. She's done all of the parts that she needed to do. It's up to Boaz to be the fulfiller of it all. Her part is to be faithful. His part is to be the fulfiller. She's done all of the things that she needed to do. And Naomi's like, okay, you have done what you needed to do. Now watch the man of action kick into action. And he will. So that brings us to chapter 4. You ready for chapter 4? It's got a super exciting end. If you've never read the book of Ruth, it's got a super good end. All right, chapter 4. So we've set this up now with the final factor here in chapter 4 of how we approach God. And this is interesting. I want to phrase it this way. Chapter 4 presents this. Person X, we're going to call him, because we never get his name, this nearer kinsman, we're going to call him Person X. He rejects the people, but God embraces them. Person X rejects the people, but God is right there to embrace him. Certainly God, represented through Boaz. Chapter 4, verse 1, here we go. Then went Boaz up to the gate of the city, and he sat himself down there, and behold, the kinsman of whom Boaz spoke, person X, came by, unto whom he said, Ho, such a one, turn aside, sit down here. And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city, and he said, Sit ye down here. And they did. Why is this happening at the gate? Because this is the courthouse. This is the legal system. This is how legal matters worked. You went to the gate of the city, and there would be the men of the city sitting there. This is where they would hang out. And so basically, Boaz is calling the court to order. He's bringing a legal matter before them. And it's interesting, when it says, Ho there, such a one, the language indicates Boaz knew his name. He didn't say, Ho there, such a one. He said, Hey, Jim, come here, sit down. He said the man's name, but the text intentionally doesn't record his name. And that's interesting, because there's only two reasons that the scripture does that. Number one, it would be to not humiliate the person. And the other reason would be to not elevate the person and give them any respect. So we already have kind of an indication of who this person X represents in the spiritual world. But he knew his name. In fact, he's a relative of Boaz in some fashion. So he's a cousin or a second cousin. So he knows who this is, but the scripture doesn't record his names. Here they are at the gate of the city. And Boaz wants to conduct this legal business. Interesting, isn't it? It kind of reminds you ever thought about, gates of the city being the place where the business is done? Have you ever thought about that in relation to what Jesus said to Peter and the disciples in Matthew chapter 16? Remember when Peter had the great confession of faith? Jesus said, who do men say that I am? And Peter confessed and said, I know who you are. You're the Christ. You're the Son of God. And what did Jesus say to him then? He said, you've got it. Yes, you've got it. Upon that information, upon that truth, upon this rock, what you just said, I will found my church. And then he said, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. All of the influence, all of the legal matters, all of the effort of hell is what's represented with the gates of hell. Everything about hell's efforts is represented there. When he says even the gates of hell won't prevail against it. There's nothing the forces of hell could do to stop the church, is what he's saying. They can come together at the gate, and they can scheme and they can plan, but they ain't going to do it. And so that's what the gates of the city represent. And even Jesus used that example. I just thought you'd find that interesting. That was for free. You don't have to pay me for that one. So verse 3. And he said unto the kinsman, Boaz did, Naomi has come again out of the country of Moab, and she's selling a parcel of land which was our brother Elimelech's. Now, when it says brother, it doesn't necessarily mean that Boaz and person X were brothers with Elimelech, Naomi's husband. It just means they're close relatives. And I thought, Boaz continuing in verse 4, Boaz says, I thought to advertise thee, saying that you should buy it before the inhabitants here and before the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, then redeem it. But if you will not redeem it, then tell me that I may know, for there is none to redeem it besides thee, and I'm after thee. And he said, now person X is going to respond and say, okay, yeah, I'll buy it. No problem. Now remember the situation here. We have a problem because person X wants the land. The people involved with this land have not been brought up yet. But Boaz has brought up the fact that Elimelech's land that stays in the family, it's there. And nobody has been owning it, using it. It's up for grabs by a male. And so person X says, I'm the closest kinsman. I will buy it. I will pay money for the land, and then it will be in my family. So the first thing that we learn about person X is that he's interested, he's more than glad, to expand his area of control. Because all he knows right now is there's land here, and I'm going to get the land, and I can use it. It's for me and for my legacy after me. It's for my kingdom. There's nothing getting in the way of that. He's very much ready to go. Person X is all about the land. More land for me? Great. More power and control for me? Great. Are you starting to get an indication of who this might represent in the spiritual realm? Now, verse 5 is the big kick. And I believe the Lord led Boaz to intentionally separate the offer like this so that you and I could see person X's response when he found out, oh, there's land. Oh, I want land. But now he's going to be told there's also people that come with the land. Verse 5, then said Boaz, well, okay, but what day you buy the field at the hand of Naomi, you must buy it also of Ruth, the Moabitess, the wife of the dead. And you must raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance. So Boaz lays the trap, and he says, okay, well, if you want the land, then you have to do what the law says and marry the widow girl that comes with the land, Ruth. And so that's the whole plot has now been laid out. And remember that the first child born to Ruth and her new husband, whoever that's going to be, will be so that they will be accounted to the family of Naomi. That's the whole point, so that Naomi and her lineage doesn't die out. That's the whole point here. They don't want that to be cut off. That was what the Lord instituted in Leviticus 25 called levirate marriage. That if a couple did not have kids and the husband died, then the closest relative to that dead husband had to marry her so that she could have kids and that family wouldn't die out. That's the whole point here. Is God is interested in a legacy. God does not want your influence, your legacy, your descendancy to pass away. He wants, even in that, you see a representation in the law that this levirate marriage was implemented so that you would continue. That's a picture of eternal life, guys. The fact that God put things in the law to say, I don't want your name, your lineage to die out. I want it to last forever. That's the only earthly way you can represent eternal life, is to represent the fact that your lineage will continue down and down and down. And so God implemented levirate marriage for that purpose. So now notice the details here. Notice now the detailed desires of person X. They're going to be revealed. Okay? We know he's interested in the land. But what is person X going to think about the fact that he has to marry Ruth and raise up children to her, to that family? Is he passionate about the people or just the possession? And so go now into verse 6. By the way, Boaz has now clearly made his revelation to everybody that he intends to marry Ruth. Because did you notice that just a few verses ago? That he said in verse 4, if you will redeem the land, then great. But if you won't redeem the land, let me know and I will. He already knows there's a girl that comes with the land. So he's already made it clear. But when he springs the trap in verse 5 and says, oh, by the way, there's a girl that comes with the land, he's already saying, I will marry her. He's already declared that now in front of the people here at the gate. Now, verse 6. The kinsman said, I cannot redeem it for myself because I would mar my own inheritance. Redeem thou my right to thyself, for I cannot redeem it. Verse 7. Now this was the manner in the former time in Israel concerning redeeming and concerning changing. For to confirm all things, a man plucked off his shoe and gave it to his neighbor, and this was a testimony in Israel. Therefore, the kinsman said unto Boaz, buy it for thee. So he drew off his shoe. In fact, when you go back and you read levirate marriage, you'll find out that the shoe was to be thrown at the guy, and then you were to spit in his face because he refuses to do his rightful part. So recognize that. When person X here is denying marrying Ruth, he's not violating the law because the law allows for you to deny it, but you deny it in disgrace. And then the next kinsman can come along and fulfill the role that you're unwilling to do. So it's a good example in the law of something that's not a sin, but it's a shame for you to deny this woman and her family a lineage. You're saying, I don't care about whether your lineage dies or not. I don't care. In fact, he said there in verse 6, person X said, if I did this, I would mar my own inheritance. Do you know how he would mar? He would mar his own inheritance because what he's saying is that if I marry Ruth and I have a child with her, that child then will inherit that land, and I'm going to be responsible to give that child an inheritance when I die. And that would take away from my inheritance that I would give to my other kids. And so he's concerned now about the fact that his power and control and his kingdom would actually be diminished because he would have less resources for his own land and for his own stuff, and he would have to give monies and resources to provide for this new land and this new child that would end up not being for him. And so he's concerned that he will actually lose control of more things if he decides to help out. So person X represents none other than Satan himself. Satan himself. He doesn't want to hurt his own kingdom. He's a nearer kinsman to mankind than God is. As the human race, angels are created beings. That's all Satan is a created being, just like we are. And then God is the creator of it all. So the angels and Satan is a closer relative to us in creation than certainly God is. And so Satan is a nearer kinsman than God is, just as this man is a nearer kinsman than Boaz is. He wants the possession for power, but he doesn't want the people. That is exactly like Satan. There's many people in the church that way that are still that way. They're interested in the power, but they're not interested in the people. You'll find that in Christian service. Still, that heart of Satan is still there to say, I'm interested in the stuff. I'm interested in control and influence, but I'm not interested in the bride of Christ. I'm not interested in the bride. I'm only interested in what I can get out of it. And you mean I have to actually help people along the way? Oh, I'm not interested in that. Christian service is about the people. It's not about building a kingdom for yourself. That's what Satan wants. And in fact, that's exactly what happened in the beginning. Satan caused Adam and Eve to fall into sin, and he took dominion. Remember, God gave Adam and Eve dominion of this whole world, right? And then Adam and Eve forfeited dominion of this world to Satan. As Paul said in Romans, whom you yield yourselves members to obey, his servants you are. Adam and Eve fell in servitude to Satan at the fall. And this whole world has been dominated by the prince of the power of the air, Satan himself. He's the God of this world, the scripture calls him. He's in control of this world. He is the dominating force in this world because we, as the human race, yielded ourselves to obey him even at the fall. But Boaz represents Jesus, the exact opposite of Satan. You remember even at the temptation of Christ, when Satan came to Jesus at the temptation of Christ, and Satan said, if you bow down to me, I will give you all the kingdoms of this world. He could offer that because he owned it. All you have to do is bow down to me. If you yield yourselves to me, then I will give you all this. But the problem is then you become his servant. And even if you own it all, he's above you, and so he still owns it. But Jesus didn't go that way. He went the hard way to redeem all of it back himself. One of the neatest pictures of redemption is that what I see there's a one-verse parable in Matthew chapter 13 that talks about the redemption of you and me. It's one verse. I don't have to read you. Usually when you read a parable, it's like, let's read a half a chapter, let's read a whole thing. One verse parable. I love this. Matthew 13, verse 44. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like unto a treasure hid in a field, That is you. It's hid in a field. That is the entire earth, the whole universe. That which, when a man, or Jesus, found it, he hid it again. And for joy thereof, he went and he sold all that he had to buy the field. He was willing to buy everything back just to get what's in the field, which is you and me and our redemption. He was willing to do it all. He didn't try to is there a way I can just get the girl because I don't have the money to pay for all this stuff. No, he went and sold all that he had to rightfully gain it all back. Think about that. In the cross of Christ, he paid such a price that he bought the entire universe back from Satan's control. And then after he bought, it's like he bought it back, and then picture this Bible as like the entire universe. He's like, I bought the whole thing. Now, where is it? Where is it? Where is it? Where is it? Oh, there it is. This is all I wanted. And that's you and me. And he sits us down, he dusts us off. He's like, I don't need this. Because this represents the universe right now, not the Bible. Right? I don't need this. I got it. I got what I wanted. That's the idea. He bought the entire universe just so he could be like, okay, where are they? There they are. That's what I wanted. Found them. We're the treasure that he went and found. I have no idea where I'm at now. So that is the neat thing about redemption. He bought it all just to win us. Just to win us. Remember when Jesus said, it does no good to gain the whole world and lose your own soul? I love that. The soul is that valuable. That's what he's saying. Compare your soul's value compared to the whole universe. Your soul is more valuable. So Jesus bought it all and said, all I need is that valuable soul. Oh, there it is. And he found us and redeemed us. I don't often do this, but I'm going to ask you, turn to Revelation chapter 5. Okay? Revelation chapter 5. If you're not sure where that's at, it's the last one. Go to the last one. I want to show you something here. In Revelation chapter 5. I'm used to hearing pages rumble when you say that, but that doesn't often happen these days because everybody's just digitally turning pages. Okay. Revelation chapter 5. Still with this imagery of Jesus redeeming the whole world just to get us. That's what's pictured here in Revelation chapter 5. As we see the church age comes to an end in Revelation 2 and 3, and then in Revelation 4, we see John is called up before the throne of God. And the first thing you see in chapter 4 of the things hereafter is this throne of God, this awesome throne of God, where the center of all of the glory of the universe, it's right there. What other way would you open up the future but to talk about the center of everything, God's throne? But then the action takes place in chapter 5. The scene is set in chapter 4, but then what's the heart of the action? Chapter 5. Read a couple of verses here, starting in verse 1. And I saw in the right hand of him that sat on the throne, God, a book written inside and on the backside, and it was sealed with 7 seals. And I saw an angel, a strong angel, proclaiming with a loud voice, who is worthy to open the book and to loose the seals thereof? And no man in heaven or earth or under the earth, Satan, was able to open the book or to even look on it. In verse 4, John, he wept much because no one was found worthy to open and to read the book, neither even to look on it. And one of the elders said to me, don't weep. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, he has prevailed to open the book and to loose the 7 seals thereof. And I beheld, and lo, in the midst of the throne and of the 4 beasts, in the midst of the elders, there stood a lamb, as it had been slain, having 7 horns and 7 eyes. This is Jesus Christ, which are the 7 spirits of God sent forth into all the earth. And he, Jesus, as looking like a crucified lamb, he came and he took the book out of the right hand of him that sat on the throne. The right hand represents power. Jesus had the ability to take something from God the Father. That's interesting. And when he had taken the book in verse 8, the 4 beasts and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, having every one of them harps and golden vials full of odors, which are the prayers of the saints. Now, verse 9 finishes this. And they all sang a new song, saying, "You are worthy to take the book." This book that represents the title deed to the earth. This book that represents getting ownership back of everything that was lost to Satan. And we sing a song that says, "You are worthy, Jesus, to take the book and to open the seals of it." Why? Because you were slain. And you have done what? You have redeemed us to God by your blood, us out of every kindred, tongue, people, and nation. This book is the proof of ownership coming back to Jesus Christ because of the cross. And the result of bringing everything back into his ownership is that he has redeemed us. He bought it all, but the purpose was just to redeem you and me. And that's what it was all for. So go back to the book of Ruth here and let's finish this up. So he bought the whole thing, and the whole purpose was you. Can you imagine that? Like he's planning on how he's going to, okay, I'm going to die on the cross. It's going to gain me everything, but all I want is them. Let's continue here in chapter 4. It's verse 9 where we pick up. And so person X has denied at the end of verse 8 here. And so now in verse 9, Boaz said unto the elders and unto the people, okay, that you are witnesses this day that I have bought all that was Elimelech's and all that was Chilion's and Mahlon's of the hand of Naomi. I want to make a quick point I just thought of recently on this. Interesting here that as he's buying, Boaz is going to step up and he's going to buy everything that was Elimelech's. Remember who was Elimelech? Naomi's husband, right? Who is Mahlon and Chilion? That was their 2 sons that Ruth and Orpah married. Okay, Ruth and Orpah, the Gentile girls, married these 2 Jewish boys, Mahlon and Chilion, right? Okay, something interesting I want to point out to you that I just thought of recently is that it's reminding us that the Redeemer bought everything that wasn't just Elimelech's, but it would have belonged to Mahlon and Chilion as well. Do you see where I'm going with this? Who's there right now? It's Naomi. It's a Ruth that's going to marry now and be able to continue her lineage. What would have happened had the other Moabite daughter also come to Israel? Guess what? She would have been redeemed. She would have had the opportunity to have her legacy continue as well. Orpah didn't. We talked about that back in chapter 1, how Ruth decided to follow after God, and Orpah's like, I'm pretty comfortable here in Moab with the fam. Going to stay. And this is reminding us, had Orpah just followed hard after God, just like Ruth, she would have been redeemed as well. She would have had a legacy to her name as well. And so the choice of the Gentiles, they were both there. And part of the Gentiles said, I'm following hard after God. And there was others that didn't. And they weren't redeemed. And they would have been had they only come after God. So here's Boaz in verse 9 saying, okay, you're all witnesses. I'm redeeming everything that was their families. And in verse 10, moreover, Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of Mahlon, have I purchased to be my wife, to raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance, that the name of the dead be not cut off from among the brethren. That's the reason they're doing it. And from the gate of this place, you are witnesses this day. So just as Boaz's redemption of Ruth was not done in secret, this is public spectacle. Jesus' redemption of us was not done in secret either. Boaz tells the people here that they're witnesses to this contractual change, right? And that's exactly, do I have it here? That's exactly what's said of Jesus in Matthew 27. As Christ is going to the cross. In verse 24, it says, when Pilate saw that he could not prevail against the people that were arguing for his crucifixion, but that rather a tumult was made. Pilate took water and he washed his hands before the people, and he said, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. See to it. Then answered all the people and said, his blood be on us and on our children. We are witnesses this day. We take responsibility. We're witnesses of this. Do it. And so certainly this witnessing was to condemnation, versus Boaz's witnessing of the people is to redemption. But so was Jesus's. The purpose behind it all was redemption, and neither one of them were done in secret or in a private way. Verse 11, and all the people that were in the gate and the elders said, we are witnesses that the Lord make the woman that is come into your house like Rachel and like Leah, which two did build the house of Israel. And do thou worthily in Ephrathah, and be famous in Bethlehem. And let thy house be like the house of Pharez, whom Tamar bore unto Judah, of the seed which the Lord shall give thee of this young woman. So Boaz and Ruth are here blessed of the people, but Jesus was cursed. But nevertheless, in both cases, the goal was the same. In both cases, the cross of Christ and Boaz's redemption of Ruth, the goal was the same, was to raise up generational life. Raise up eternal life is the actual idea of it all. And that's the goal in both cases. And they're both witnessed to by the people. And now in verse 13, so Boaz took Ruth, and she was his wife. And when he went in unto her, the Lord gave her conception, and she bare a son. And the woman said unto Naomi, blessed be the Lord, which has not left thee this day without a kinsman, that his name may be famous in Israel. And he said, and he shall be unto thee a restorer of life, and a nourisher of thy old age, for thy daughter-in-law which you love, which is better to thee than 7 sons, has borne him. And Naomi, representing the Jews, she took the child and laid it in her bosom, and became nurse unto it. in picture here, this is the church, the Gentiles, showing respect back to Israel, saying, God has not left you childless. You're not cut off. And we as the church, we should be saying the same thing to Israel today. We should be saying, you're still Israel, and we're still the bride of Christ. And God has not left you without a legacy. And we should be bringing Christ back now to Israel. You know, Israel that in the beginning of this story led Ruth towards God. And that's what the Jews did for us today. They gave us the scriptures down through the years. And they gave us revelation of God. And now we have Christ. We have the Son. And we should bring him to Israel and say, this is what you've done for us. You've given us revelation of Jesus Christ. And we want you to be blessed with him. Oh, what a picture. What a picture. And now and certainly, by the way, in the last days, this will be ultimately fulfilled. Because we know in the end, Christ at his second coming will come right to Israel. Zechariah 9, 10, 11. He will present himself to Israel. And at that moment, all Israel that is there will be saved. And they will receive the Son that's given to them. For unto you a child is born, unto you a son is given. Israel, to Israel. Verse 17, let's close it out. And the woman, her neighbors, gave it a name, saying, there is a son born to Naomi. A son meaning in her lineage, right? Obviously it was born to Ruth. There's a son born to Naomi. And they called his name Obed. He is the father of Jesse, who is the father of David. Now, these are the generations of Pharaoh. Now, going way back to Pharaoh, a long time ago, who was one of the sons of Judah. So Pharaoh begot Hezron. This is a little bit of a genealogy here to close this out. Hezron had a son named Ram. Ram had a son named Aminadab. He had a son named Nahshon. Nahshon begat Salmon. That's where it gets interesting, this little genealogy. Salmon begot Boaz. So Boaz's father was Salmon. Salmon begot Boaz. Boaz begot Obed. We just read about that. Boaz and Ruth had this son, Obed. Obed will go on to have a son named Jesse, which we know about. He will be coming up in the book of 1 Samuel. Jesse is David's father, who becomes King David. Now, this genealogy a couple of things about this genealogy to close the book. It's very interesting in that it gives us very strong evidence that the book of Ruth was written during the time period of King David. Because if it has to be written no earlier than that, or they wouldn't have known to put the name David. But it's not written long after the time of David either. Because had it been, they would have continued this into Solomon the Great, right? But they didn't. They stopped right here at King David. And so that's very strong evidence that the book was written during the time period of King David's life. Another one, just for those that are super curious, was actually back in verse 7 there, where the author of the book makes it a point to explain the tradition that they went through of handing the shoe instead of throwing the shoe that they pointed out in verse 7. That's another time marker to know when this was written. So that's what gives us strong evidence to know that it was written in the days of King David. But one of the other fascinating things about this genealogy, if you didn't piece this together yet, is that it tells us that Boaz's father was Salmon, who knows? He knew, I don't know. You could never know names in the scripture. But anyway, this guy, we know from Matthew's genealogy of Jesus Christ, he married Rahab the harlot. Do you remember the story of Joshua coming into the land and Rahab the harlot was the one that protected them and helped them, and she was then protected and brought into faith. And she became a believer, and she became an integral part here in Israel. Boaz grew up with a believing mom, but not just a believing mom in Rahab. He grew up with a Gentile mother. Boaz knew what it was like to show grace and love and respect to the Gentiles. So here God uses Boaz, who is half Jewish and half Gentile. God uses Boaz as the Redeemer. Isn't that cool? That's the man God used to bring Ruth in. That's the man God used to represent himself as the Redeemer. See, guys, Jesus doesn't just have Gentiles on his mind. Jesus has Gentiles in his blood. You're in his very life's existence. We are a part of who he is. That's the extent that he loves us and cares about us. You ever thought about that? The earthly man, Jesus, had much Gentile blood in him. Certainly he was raised Jewish in a Jewish culture. But Boaz's mother and then Boaz's wife are Gentiles that come into the lineage of Jesus Christ himself. So what a neat end to the story to show us how deep the Redeemer is actually tied to the people, tied to you and me. See, person X doesn't respect the people. He wants the power. He wants the possession. The Redeemer wants the people. And that's the picture. If you leave this book of Ruth with nothing else, you remember that. That Christ did everything that he did simply for you. He didn't do it for the stuff. He didn't do it for the power and for the advancement. He did it for you. It's almost as if he threw away the other stuff just to get you. And then to see the way that he presents that, well, this was presented to Satan. Satan wanted the stuff, but the moment he found out that there was people to help, he's like, I'm not interested in people. And that's such an opposite example of than what Jesus Christ offers to us. He did it explicitly for you, in spite of the stuff. Remember the parable from Matthew chapter 13? He bought the whole field just so he could get what he called the treasure. Who cares about the field? I got the treasure. Yeah, but there's a really good apple tree right over there. I don't care. I got the treasure. Right? I love it. So the story of Ruth, it's a great picture of our approach towards God in redemption. From going back to chapter 1, back in the beginning, the question is, do we desire knowledge of God? Would we do what Ruth did and come towards God with that little knowledge that we do have? Even today as believers, we don't have full knowledge and revelation of God. We only have so much. And it's still to us to come towards God with what we know. God, I don't know what this is. I don't know all about this, but I believe you. I trust what I do know. I'm coming towards you. Or would you be like Orpah and say, no, I'm pretty comfortable right here. Thanks anyway. I think it would be hard if I went towards God. I think I'll just stay right here. That was the choice from chapter 1, that Ruth chose to go towards God. And then chapter 2, God is working the circumstances together for the good. God's grace-filled plan doesn't just happen, but it's because God chooses to get involved with those whose hearts are perfect towards him. You remember that from the Chronicles? It says, the eyes of the Lord are looking throughout the whole world, looking for whom he can show himself strong on behalf of. That's his interest. And then chapter 2, we saw that. And then in chapter 3, we saw Ruth presenting herself boldly but humbly to to Boaz. And it raises the question, are we approaching God in that same way? Humbly, with an attitude of service? God, I want to serve you. I want to help. I just want to be by your side. I want to be by your feet. That should be our approach even today, as Ruth approached Boaz, and he saw that integrity in her. And then finally in chapter 4, the willing Redeemer, he pays the heavy price for his love for the treasure that was in the field. What a love, what a cost. We stand forgiven at the cross, right? Story of Ruth. We just came out of Judges and looking at all that darkness of Judges, and you get the book of Ruth and it's like, there is godliness somewhere. Do you ever feel that way in this culture? You go to work, you go places, and you're like, oh. And then you come to church and it's like, there is godliness. There is people that love the Lord. That's the way I feel about reading the book of Ruth. I hope you do too. So Lord willing, next time we're together, we're going to jump into 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel, read ahead. Take a look at the first 3 chapters of 1 Samuel, and we'll be doing that the next time we're together. So we're going to transition now to our communion service as we finished up a book. That's our custom. So go ahead, Stephen. And